All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Sadia. I'm the program coordinator here at Gale Borden Public Library. I would like to thank you all for joining us tonight for this very timely and informative program on mindful conversations around race. Unfortunately, we are faced with some very challenging times, and I hope that we can all benefit from tonight's program. Before we begin, I do want to let you know we are in a webinar format, so your audio and video will be off. If you have questions, they can be entered in the Q&A box that's on the bottom of your screen, or there should be an icon for raising your hand. If you want to do that, we can unmute you at the end and you can ask the questions that way. So, and like I said, they'll be addressed at the end of the presentation. And now I want to introduce our presenter for today, who is Dr. Nathalie Edmond. She's a licensed clinical psychologist and experienced yoga teacher who takes an intricate perspective to her consultations and trainings. Dr. Edmond completed her bachelor's degree in psychology and sociology from Rutgers University, and she completed her doctorate in clinical psychology at Wright State University School of Professional Psychology. She has also been intensively trained in mindfulness-based approaches to therapy. Tonight, she's going to discuss strategies for talking about race with children, teens, and adults from a compassionate place. And she's going to also answer any questions that you may have. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Dr. Edmond, who, by the way, is coming to you live from New Jersey. All right, take it away, Ms. Edmond.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you all talking about something I am really passionate about. I think about just the challenging times we're living in, and as well as how we need to care for ourselves and our communities. I hope that at the end of our time together, it gives you just a little bit more tools, and we'll begin our time to get together with a little bit of mindfulness, a little bit of meditation, a little bit of storytelling, just to set a tone. So I want you to think about mindfulness meditation as just an opportunity to arrive, an opportunity to check in with yourself, to notice what you bring into this virtual space. In meditation, we're not really trying to achieve anything. We're just building curiosity and awareness. So at any time in the meditation, you might notice discomfort or restlessness, or a state of calm or a busy mind, and all of that is welcome. So you can have a soft gaze or you can close your eyes. And we begin with just arriving into the chair or whatever might be supporting you at this moment. Feeling the earth below you. Feeling the air touching your skin. Noticing the imprint the day has left on your body. Perhaps noting the way that your body is talking to you. Perhaps starting with the crown of your head, drawing awareness in a body scan down the body. Noticing any tension in the face, maybe the jaw. Noting any tension in the neck and shoulders. Perhaps any places of ease. Down the chest, torso and belly, down through the hips, and the legs, and the feet. Just this kind awareness of settling, maybe softening a little bit more with every moment that passes. What happens when we slow down a little bit more from our daily lives? Noting the images and the thoughts, maybe even the to-do list. Maybe noticing if the chatter of the mind is just a little bit less intense. Maybe a little bit more space in between your thoughts. Perhaps connecting to that place inside of yourself that helps to ground you, center you. Finding a little bit more steadiness, following the rhythm of your breath. The inhale and the exhale. No need to try to control the breath, just notice it. This breath cycle that we take for granted so often. Feeling the sensation of the breath. At the end of your next exhale, inviting you to just whisper your name to yourself. The next exhale, at the bottom of that breath, whisper the name of a loved one. Wishing them well. I invite you to hold space for the lives of other individuals who no longer can feel the rhythm of their breath. Tamir Rice, Ezel Ford, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, Stefan Clark, Rolando Castillo, Sandra Bland, Tony McDade, Ahmad Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. These are just a few of the Black lives who have been killed or murdered in the last several years, often in interaction with a police officer. Just checking in with yourself as you heard those names, what came up for you? I want you to imagine that one of those names was a loved one of yours. Perhaps a mother, a father, a grandparent, an aunt or uncle, a significant other, a friend, a child of your own? What if you received a phone call letting you know of their death? Perhaps some described it as a murder. What if you heard justifications about why their death or murder occurred? What if there was no justice for your loved one? As you imagine that, notice what arises for you in your body, in your mind, in your heart. What do you stay with? What do you turn away from? Letting go of that imagery, I want you to think about another loved one. But this time, this loved one is accused of a Black life's murder. So I want you to imagine, what if a significant other or parent or child of yours was accused of taking a Black life? How would you feel? How would you react? All of these situations bring up a lot of potential emotion or even a numb or frozen response. How did we get to this place of 2020 with these two great pandemics, COVID-19 and racial injustice? It did not start this year. This story goes back more than 400 years. I offer you the story by Ruth King, a Black queer meditation teacher. She speaks of racial harm and the untold story of racism that needs to be told in order for change and healing to happen. She invites white families, particularly raising white children, to read or tell a variation of the story to their children. You adapt for the age and circumstance. My child, I'd like to tell you from my lips the truth about our racial history, about whiteness and about being a member of the white tribe. Years ago, our ancestors did a horrific deed against the human race. They owned Black people as slaves and treated them with utter disrespect. Beatings, rape, torture, lynching, ongoing terror. We sold their children to the highest bidders and owned them as possessions. And we relied on them to grow our food and take care of our children, your ancestors. We enslaved them. Yes, our people did this. White people. Not only did we do this to Blacks, but we did this hateful thing to people who we felt were substandard. And we thought a lot of people were substandard, like the native people of this country. We came here and colonized a land that was already inhabited and self-governed by many different indigenous tribes. But instead of working peacefully with them, we went to war with them and killed many. We were brutal. We also did horrific things to Mexicans, to Jews, Japanese, and Chinese. We did this to poorer people than we were. We even did this to people who we now consider to be white, but once upon a time, we did not think they were good enough to be white. Like the Italians, the Irish, the Polish. At some point, we deemed them okay to be white. It's true that the greatness of this country, to a large extent, is due to the slave labor of Blacks, and we owe them a huge debt. We have, as a white race, disenfranchised them and systematically organized to keep them from participating in and benefiting from the wealthiest country in the world. Our success, however big or small, and the many privileges we enjoy as a family are rooted in this stained and denied history. Even to this day, our people benefit from the institutional practices that intentionally and systematically oppress Black and brown bodies. Many poor white people feel that they are better than Black people, even better than the first Black president of the United States. Being ashamed about this is not as helpful as understanding that we have a lot of work to do to begin to respect Blacks and dark lives, to release and share the wealth and privileges we have for all they have given to us as white people. Blacks, Indigenous, and other people of color are rightfully angry toward us because of the centuries of hatred and disrespect we have shown them. We have continued as a collective to build prisons to hide and erase them. That is the legacy of the 13th Amendment. Instead of facing the years of hatred toward them and shame toward ourselves that have resulted in destroyed hearts, minds, and communities. Most important, we have died inside as a result of making hatred normal as a race. We have become numb, dismembered, crude, and unloving toward our own race because we cannot access the depth of love as a collective with such a stained and unfinished history of disrespect and hatred toward other humans. What this means to you and me is that we must wake up to this history and own that we walk with great ease in this country on their still sore backs. Backs we whipped into submission. What we witness today in the Black collective expression is the result of generations of Blacks who have witnessed their parents and grandparents killed, lynched, raped by our men, and hated and disrespected by us. They were helpless against it. We made sure of that. You need to understand, my child, that while we have other fears, we tend to walk without racial fear, and they don't. The world is not safe for them and other people like them. Black and brown lives. And it is because of our history, our whiteness. To this day, we have better schools and access, and we still are the central race in all aspects of respectable society, work, and leadership. Black communities are largely poor and their schools are disenfranchised because we have kept them at a disadvantage. Many of them are considered criminals even though they are not doing anything more than we do in our communities. Yet they are imprisoned and used again as slave labor. Many whites want to maintain white supremacy, and there continues to be white nationalist rallies and terror attacks on other races near and far, currently emboldened by senior members of the government. We have done horrible things as a white race, unspeakable things. Yet we have not been honest with each other or spoken about it as a white race. While you and I may not have done these things personally, this is our history and our inheritance. Our challenge is to do everything humanly possible to recognize and interrupt any act of disrespect an unearned privilege and to use our voices, our bodies, and our hearts to make this wrong right. We need this in order to be free. This does not mean kissing up to Blacks or anyone else, although it may seem that way. Rather, it means a willingness to face into our history, into the pain they carry because we've been so cavalier, numb, and blind to the role we have played in the past and present horrors of their lives. Our job now and for a long time is to own up to it, apologize and recognize that their expressed pain is not directed to you or me as an individual, but to us as a white race and as the institutional power that continues to oppress them, often through our ignorance, greed, comfort, righteousness, and indifference. I tell you this because you may well receive much disdain from Black people. When they see you, they are also seeing our unclaimed and terrorizing history. They see you as someone who, like our forefathers, hated them, and they see our ignorance. The way we casually delight in a disowned and forgotten history. A history where we considered them as less than human, as possessions, as chattel. This history wasn't that long ago. They are and should be hurt and angry by our utter neglect and generational hatred. There is much to be done. There is no time for guilt and shame. We must forgive ourselves and correct this wrong. We must become advocates for all of humanity, especially Black and dark-skinned bodies. Enough said for now, but we will speak of this again and again and again. And checking in with yourself again as you hear and reflect on that history of the United States, the racial history. I invite you into the next several minutes to take this lens of race, to start to see everything from this lens of race. It's always there, but do we always see it? Our racial and ethnic identity and our proximity to whiteness or to Black, Indigenous, or people of color may impact how much we see and understand racism in this country. This story is just one variation of a conversation we can have with the people around us. I think it's important to think about that we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. So if we have had segregated experiences, if we have not had a lot of integration, a lot of cross-cultural, cross-racial discussions, then we will see the world in a particular way. Just like our mood guides our attention. Our fears, our anger, our sadness, our despair, it guides our attention. We see the world through those lenses. Some traditions talk about multiple realities. I offer this from Buddhism, this concept of ultimate reality versus relative reality. So ultimate reality is this notion that there is inherent worth and dignity in all human beings. This is this idea that we're all connected. All lives matter. If you believe in certain traditions of God or goddess or gods, this idea of all of us coming from one universal consciousness and returning to that when we leave our bodies. That is one reality. Another reality, relative reality, is that when we drop into this earth at this time, we see that while we may all be born with inherent worth and dignity, that is not always what happens. That there is a hierarchy of who's on top, who's on bottom, and this happens in all societies. It's not unique to the United States. In this relative reality, some people have more power and privilege. Their lives appear to matter more. Their lives and bodies are centered. We see it in culture, in politics, in our media. And in this, we see that we need to have rallying calls like Black Lives Matter, because the voices of those individuals tend to pretty consistently say, I don't experience this world as if my life matters as much as everyone else's. And so we continue to have these Black Lives Matter, trans lives matter, women's lives matter, all abilities matter. We need to be able to start to talk about these multiple realities that will help guide our conversations in a mindful way. So one fundamental principle in anti-racism work, or talking about race, is identifying that the United States was built on white supremacy. So this notion that whiteness sits on top and Blackness sits on the bottom. That's how the country was founded. Why else would a group of white people enslave a group of Black people? Our forefathers, they set up this foundation. And what were the identities of our forefathers who came from Europe, who wanted to separate from England, who was moving away from slavery? How many of those founding forefathers owned slaves? They were white, they were cis male, they were heterosexual, they were able-bodied, they were Christian, particularly Protestant, they were upper class, they were educated. That became the top of the pyramid of white supremacy. And that influenced who had power, who didn't, and who was valued. And from there, we start to see white privilege come. So that for generations to come, just simply by living in a white body or being light-skinned gives you more privilege. The thing with privilege is, even if you're poor, you are not discriminated against you because of race. You have other discriminations and biases and hardships, but race is not one of them. The thing with privilege is it opens doors that you may not even realize are closed to some. It allows you to use energy to focus on something other than race. The thing with privilege is you don't have to think about so many different things. That's why it appears as if we're living in different realities. So this is one of my favorite pyramids of talking about white supremacy, because white supremacy is so much more accurate than institutional racism. So that's there too. That's embedded in white supremacy. But white supremacy is in the air we breathe. It's in everything. And once we start to really see it, it's hard to unsee it. So when we think of white supremacy, at least I did for many, until the last probably several years, I always thought of white supremacy as white supremacists, like individuals, groups, particularly KKK, those walking around in those white robes. But white supremacy, right, that kind of white supremacy is really just the top of the pyramid. Mass murders, unjust police shootings, lynching, hate crimes. But we see so much more, right? In the middle of this pyramid, we see all the institutional racism, all the ways in which white people were allowed to have hundreds of years of a head start to build and accumulate wealth, to take care of their families. We see mass incarceration, which 13th documentary is a great way to learn about mass incarceration, how it comes from the 13th Amendment, and how it was really emboldened in the last 40 years across both Republican and Democratic presidents. Why is it that we see more incarceration of Black and Latinx individuals? It's an interesting question. We see the school to prison pipeline, hiring discrimination, redlining, which was sanctioned by our government, that allowed certain neighborhoods to be deemed as white neighborhoods and other neighborhoods to be deemed as Black or Latinx. And so those in white neighborhoods, the homes were valued for more. And that Black individuals couldn't buy in those white areas. And that starts to set up the inequities, the ways in which the GI Bill was not accessible to Black military veterans, and how it helped white families after World War II to have access to funds for education and purchasing a home, more of a head start. After slavery, we see the ways in which lynching was meant to terrorize people. We see the way in which Jim Crow laws were meant to segregate and dehumanize people, to say, you're free, but you're still less than. All of this builds to inequity. We see Eurocentric curriculum, racist mascots, tokenism, this focus on individualism and meritocracy. Those are all here on the pyramid. Colorblindness. Though when you don't see my color, you don't really see me. It's a way that we don't have to really talk. We engage in a culture of a politeness, which means that we don't really have really deep, meaningful conversations. Not about race anyway. Even when we understand a little bit about racism, if we're white, we might start to have that white savior complex, where we still disempower Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We let friends and family members get away with racist jokes. We think we have a pass if we have proximity to Blackness or person of color. We don't validate the experiences of people of color, or we expect them to exert emotional labor to try to convince us why we should care. So we see the bottom of this pyramid is indifference, whether that's being apolitical, because all that really means is that whoever wins, whatever laws get passed, it doesn't apply to me because I have that kind of privilege. Indifference is simply living your life, taking care of your family, taking care of your needs, and just not putting energy towards anti-racism or challenging white supremacy. So the power of the pyramid shows how much indifference really supports white supremacy. Because if there was less indifference at the bottom of the pyramid, white supremacy pyramid could not persist. If you imagine all of these as bricks in this pyramid. Here's just a slightly different version that shows overt white supremacy, which tends to be socially unacceptable, and then, like an iceberg, all the things below that are covert white supremacy and socially acceptable. Calling the police on Black people, white silence. White parents self-segregating into neighborhoods and schools. What is a good school district? How are they funded? How does that create unequal access for certain individuals? What do we teach in schools? So prioritizing white voices as experts. So there are all these things that perhaps we're in here somewhere. We see ourselves, that we are part of the system. How many times have we heard the phrase, all lives matter, make America great again? How many times have we treated kids of color as adults, criminalized them at age 9, blamed the victims, justified why things happen? This idea of meritocracy, that anyone can achieve the American dream, that is a biased view, because that doesn't take into account many other barriers. Microaggressions such as, "You're so articulate." So I ask myself every day, what am I doing to challenge or disrupt white supremacy? And what am I doing to be complicit? Because to do nothing, to turn a blind eye, to not be aware, that is complicitness, which supports the system. So white supremacy culture, that's an interesting thing. Perhaps you didn't see yourself on the pyramid, but perhaps you see how white supremacy culture is in many places. The striving for perfection, the sense of urgency, this building of a resume, defensiveness, quantity over quality, worship of the written word, paternalism, either or thinking, power hoarding and scarcity mindset, fear of open conflict, really focus on individualism, objectivity, being comfortable and shaming people. This is part of white supremacy culture. What are we doing to be aware and challenge that? So Ruth King, who I read The Untold Story of Racism from, in her book, Transforming Racism from the Inside Out, called Mindful of Race, she talks about in her Mindful of Race workshops how whites commonly say, "I don't see color, aren't we all the same? Race is an illusion. Why are people of color so attached to this? I'll just listen. I know I have a lot to learn. I'm likely to say something stupid. I don't know what I don't know. People of color need to teach me. Why are people of color so angry with me? I don't know how to have these conversations without feeling blame, guilty, angry, or frustrated. I'm oppressed in other ways, so I know what it feels like to be a person of color. We can't really talk about race because not enough people of color are here." And then we hear people of color, or what's now being called BIPOC people, to really highlight that people of color, it's too broad of a term. And people of color was probably created by white people to be politically correct. And that we want to really honor the stories of people in the United States. So BIPOC identifies Black because there's a unique history of Blacks in the United States. Indigenous because they were the origins of this country. And adding people of color. So BIPOCs commonly say, "I'm going to have to teach white folks what they choose to deny knowing. I'm angry about race, but if I talk about it, I'm labeled the angry person and nobody listens. When we talk about race, we're going to talk about Black and white folks. I'm neither. I'm invisible. Race is a concept. Why can't I get over it? When will white people take responsibility for their collective impact on other races around the world? I don't want to keep educating white people. They need to educate themselves. I don't need to be friends with white people. I just want them to stop getting in my way and stop doing harm. I'd like to focus on something other than race, but people who look like me keep getting harmed." Just thinking about the Breonna Taylor verdict that came out yesterday. The cumulative trauma of the injustice, right? And we see the different lens, the different realities that people are living in. That some don't see what the big deal is. Justice was served. And others who are grieving and are enraged. So Ruth King talks about the 6 barriers, hindrances, to talking about race in a mindful way. The fact that white people don't tend to see themselves as a race, as a group with this history. They see themselves as good individuals, and when you're a good individual, you're not racist. To be associated with racism is to be bad, that binary system. So conversations really break down if I, as a Black woman, is thinking about groups, and you as a white person is thinking about an individual, then of course you're going to take things personally. You're going to find the exceptions. You're going to be defensive. So we have to invite white people to start to own what whiteness is, as a culture, as a race. And there are probably things that white people gave up, ethnicity and other things, in order to achieve the American dream. Internalized oppression, where we internalize racism. This applies to all people, white and BIPOC individuals. We internalize, we are indoctrinated into this white supremacy system. So how do we not have bias? We all have bias. Take the Harvard implicit bias test. You'll see we all have bias. But that internalized racism helps us as BIPOC individuals turn against each other, to use those same standards that are used to judge us, to judge other BIPOC individuals. None of us are immune without effort. This difference between stars and constellations. So often the star is, oh, it's just a bad apple, a bad cop, a bad mayor, a bad CEO, a bad principal. But why don't we start to look at the orchard? What is the orchard like that produced the so-called bad apple? Perhaps it is the whole system. That's the constellation. When we see a Breonna Taylor murder, some people just see that as an isolated incident. Others see it as a constellation, a pattern happening across many cities over many years. We have to move away from good intentions to impact. If the impact is harm, we have to be accountable and make repairs. It's not about being perfect, but it's about being accountable and making a change. We have to look at how across generations we're passing on this trauma, this grief. We have to look at white privilege and the ways in which white people protect each other. They collude with each other, they're blind, they're silent, and the ways in which BIPOC individuals play into the system for their own safety. So all people are impacted by racism. Everyone is impacted by it. So I like this racial equity metaphor, which says that if you have a lake in front of your house and one fish is floating belly up dead, it makes sense to analyze the fish. What's wrong with it? Imagine the fish as one student failing in the education system. We'd ask, did it study hard enough? Is it getting the support it needs at home? But if you come out to that same lake and half the fish are floating belly up dead, what should you do? This time you've got to analyze the lake. Imagine the lake is the education system and half the students are failing. This time we'd ask, might the system itself be causing such consistent, unacceptable outcomes for students? If so, how? Picture 5 lakes around your house, and in each and every lake, half the fish are floating belly up dead. What is it time to do? We say it's time to analyze the groundwater. So when we see these patterns emerge in different cities, in different school districts, in different police departments, we have to stop looking at isolated incidents. We have to look at the whole system of white supremacy and all the ways it flows from there. We have to start to see, like, instead of blaming the individual, we can start to ask, what happened to this person? And maybe instead of blaming a whole race of people, we start to say, what happened to this race of people? What are the barriers? What are the biases? What are the things getting in the way? We'll look at just a few. We see that this is America's racial wealth divide. This is from 2013, looking at the median household income. We see that when you combine Black and Hispanic households together, there's more than 100,000 gap with white household. This is the 400-year head start. We add the Asian group into that, and we see that there's a lot of discussion about the model minority, which is anti-Blackness at its core. And so when we look at this, we see that this gives you access to different resources or limits you. And we look at patterns. We know that there are always exceptions, right? That there are poor white people here, there are poor Asian people, there are wealthy Hispanic people, there are wealthy Black people. But these are kind of more the predominant gaps. And how does that impact education, healthcare, a lot of our basic needs. This looks at the pregnancy-related deaths, that Black and Indigenous women are more likely to die of deaths than any other racial group. Why is that? Is that biology? Is it the way that Black women seek healthcare? Is it the bias of the healthcare professionals? Is it the ways in which the symptoms and concerns of Black women are heard and treated and respected? We look at racial disparities in school discipline. Why is it that Black students are 3 to 4 times more likely than white students to be suspended multiple times or expelled? Is it the individuals? Are they responsible? Is it a whole racial problem? Or is it bias? We see that bias starts in preschool. There are studies out there that show that. If you're looking for problematic behavior, you're likely to find it. We see here that white people are still the largest demographic in the adult population. And yet, we see that in terms of prison population, there's an equal proportion of Black, Hispanic, and white. So there's a disproportionate amount of Black and Hispanic in the prison system, given their representation in the larger society. Why is that? There are more judges, more police officers that are white, and of course white people are killed by police officers as well. But when we look at ratios, we see there's such a gap. So white fragility, that is something that needs to be addressed in order for us to have more productive conversations. It's noticing, when do you feel defensive? When do you retreat into anger, fear, guilt, and shame? When do you freeze? When do you allow yourself to sit in silence versus pushing yourself to say something? These are just more of the things that get in the way, right? Fear of saying the wrong thing, of not being liked. So what is the Black Lives Matter movement? There's so much discussion about it. It was founded in 2012 by 3 queer Black women who had a lot of closeness to men in their life who were experiencing police brutality, who were being incarcerated for mental health issues, and they wanted something to change. And it went beyond just police brutality. It wasn't that all lives don't matter. It was that we're centering the stories of Black lives. It's not anti-police. It's saying that we need to change the way that we over-police certain communities and under-police others. We need to change some of the laws that disproportionately target urban communities of color. It's not promoting violence. It's saying that we need to address our racial history and all the inequities that are built into it. We're always choosing to be anti-racist or complicit. To be not racist is to be neutral. It's not a strong enough stance. We can work towards moving from indifference and apathy to being more aware, to being more active and an advocate. We can start wherever we are. Perhaps it's, you know, someone who you care about, who's a BIPOC individual, and you want to change the world so that they can suffer less. Perhaps you start to see, like, it's not just the person you care about, it's all these other people who have similar identities. And maybe eventually you get to the social justice lens where you're like, this is an issue. Mass incarceration is an issue. Perhaps you believe that maybe we should focus on treatment for addiction rather than criminalization, that cuts across all racial lines. When we start this process of anti-racism, it's scary. There's so much to learn. There's so many things perhaps you were not aware of or you participated in unknowingly or knowingly. But now you know better. So are you going to do better? Are you going to sit in your discomfort? Are you going to invite your friends into conversation? How are you going to educate yourself? Examine your biases. Have the talk with your children so that if all children are having talks about race, then perhaps we change it for this generation and generations to come? How do we lift up the voices of BIPOC individuals? How do we let them do it their way, even if we don't agree with their languaging? How do we hold space for rage, which is often an accumulation of silence and grief and hurt and pain? How do we start to make reparations? How do you support BIPOC-owned businesses? How do you surround yourself with BIPOC excellence and beauty, and how do you surround your kids with that? How do we start to dismantle anti-racist policies in our school boards, in our schools, in our police forces, in our jobs? How do we build curiosity about difference when our kids start to point it out? They start to point it out as young as 3 years of age. How do we not shut it down? How do we reward them and celebrate oh, that's so great you noticed that, and ask them questions and get them to start to critically think? The younger we start, the more we can build on it so that we don't raise another generation of people who have a really hard time talking about race. So think about, where are you on the journey? That would mean a different conversation with people, right? If you are in the innermost circle where you are fully on board, anti-racist, you know this is the long haul, that's so different than someone on the outer extreme who is actively resisting this notion of racism and reparations. I often say that I speak not to change others, but rather to heal myself. So how do you go into conversations in a way that you're not trying to change the other person? You're allowing yourself to be vulnerable, to speak from your own experience, your own vulnerability, the own work that you're doing, the things that you're noticing in your own life. Not from a place of all-knowing, not from a place of condescension, but from really critically thinking about your own social identity and the privileges you carry or the ways in which you are oppressed. So maybe that starts by saying, as a Black cis woman, when I hear blah, 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 this is what comes up for me. I'm owning which part of me is talking. So with all conversations, start with stop, take a breath, and proceed mindfully. What do you really want to accomplish? Calling out people is shaming. Inviting people in, getting consent. Hey, do you have a few minutes to talk? I saw your post on Facebook, or I saw your post on Instagram, or, oh, I just heard you talking about blah, 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 right? Try to see the other person's perspective. Try to humanize them. We all have racist ideas and racist policies because we've all been indoctrinated into this country. Thinking about how our capacity to allow people to be in their truth, that is a real sign of love. Apologize when we make mistakes, because I guarantee you will make mistakes. Take responsibility and ask how you can make it right. Own it. Don't defend, don't explain, it doesn't matter your intentions. And this is more where you can keep up with me. My website, drnatedmond.com, if you want to take my anti-assessment just to see where you are in this process. I'd love to hear some of your questions or comments.
Okay, thank you, Natalie. That was wonderful. I do have a raised hand, Joyce. I'm going to go ahead and let you, should be able to talk now if you. Joyce, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure I intentionally meant to hit the hand, but I'm wondering, as you share your presentations, and I'm imagining that you are sharing in different contexts and different audiences.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us some insight? It's so what's the responses been like, or what has the follow-up been like? questions that folks may want to ask and get some more insight?
I mean, what's interesting about the presentations I do is often people self-select to go to them. So it's already an audience that's already curious in some way. I think the questions that people tend to have is they're looking at their own biases. They're looking at the things they didn't know, the ways in which they've been complicit in white supremacy. I think they're really looking for how to fix it. There's an urgency to them, and I'm often encouraging them to slow down, but this is a marathon. People often go on to do, like I have an anti-racism series that they do, or they go up to various different workshops that's being offered. They start a book club. They just really engage with people around them who will help them continue to uncover what they didn't know, because there's so much history we don't know. And we're just scratching the surface of all the ways that it is built into our culture. And how do we really invite people into conversation in a way that is honoring their full humanity and is compassionate and not shaming? So that's usually a skill set that people need to build, as well as to sit with discomfort and not knowing and confusion. Those are some of the things we talk about. People talk about like how to transform their classrooms, how to transform their organizations to become more anti-racist. What are some of the cultural things that happen in organizations that promote ongoing racism? And if they want to diversify their staff or their student body, these are all questions that they ask.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And just as a follow-up, will we have access to your materials? I did some writing, but it was a challenge to keep up. So I saw some things I'd really like to kind of contemplate.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to share that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
And I did, Joyce, I did record this. So this is recorded. So anyone who wants to view it again, I can send a link. Just email me. My email was on the reminder link that you are probably received. So just email me at that email address and I can send you the link.
Sounds great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Joyce.
Anybody else have any questions? We're a quiet group tonight.
Mm-hmm. It's a lot to digest for sure.
Definitely. We hope you all got something out of this. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. You're welcome, Jeanette.
Thank you very much for being here. It was an interesting presentation, and yeah, I certainly saw some things that I can add to my repertoire.
Fantastic.
That's great. I mean, that's what it takes sometimes is, you know, word of mouth, people, you hear it, you pass it on, and hopefully, you know, the more people we can pass it along to, hopefully we can make a difference.
That's great. Well, it's been a pleasure.
From your lips to God's ears.
Sounds good.
Amen.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Well, everyone, enjoy your evening, the rest of your evening. Thank you again so very much for joining us. Thank you, Nathalie.
You're welcome. Take good care.
All right. Yes, everybody take care.
Bye.
Bye.